Well, thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I would like to start thanking the Pontifical Academy and Sister Helen and Cardinal Thurston. Last time we met, we were in the Red Room in a session in FAO about indigenous people's food systems. Very nice to sit down again next to you. And of course, Professor Von Braun, it's a long way that we've been, and it's really nice to be here today. I want to greet and thank Her Excellency, the Minister, Sonia Wujajara, and thank, of course, on behalf of FAO and on behalf of the coalition, the fact that Brazil has joined the coalition is a great news. We've been discussing in Brasilia, in New York, in Rome, and it's very important for us that Brazil is joining the coalition. I'm going to be talking about four platforms or initiatives that FAO is currently engaged on and that we are facilitating and coordinating. And in a way, it's answering some of the questions that Professor Mohammed mentioned on similar mechanisms to exchange knowledge with indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples and how we go about co-creating knowledge. I don't have the remote for the presentation, so I don't know if somebody can help me with. But just coming on the way here, I was reflecting about, and I would like to reflect together with the audience, Professor Von Braun, about how is knowledge going to look in the coming years? And there's an ongoing debate on two important areas. The first one is how digitalization in schools has not necessarily assisted knowledge, but has created a flow of information in children. This has not transformed all the time in knowledge. And what are the issues about that? And the other one is about artificial intelligence. We have artificial intelligence that is already being used by academics, already being used by researchers. How are we going to go about this? Now, if we look back at the history of humankind, we see that the most influential people in the world very often have been people that have spoken with wisdom, and have transmitted oral knowledge. The main prophets did not write books. Whether Jesus, the Buddha, or Muhammad, they didn't write the books, but they carried the wisdom in their oral communication. And if there's something that we can learn from on indigenous people's knowledge, is the fact that they have wisdom in their oral communication. And they prove that in many different ways. But the main difference between us scientists and indigenous peoples is that when we carry out an experiment, or when our hypothesis is wrong, we can still try again until we get it right. But indigenous peoples for thousands of years, they needed to get it right, and they needed to adjust their systems of knowledge to make sure that they feed their families, their communities, because failure to do so resulted in famine, or resulted in migration, or resulted in conflict. So I think there is something evident about indigenous people's knowledge today that we need to acknowledge, particularly those of us that we are not indigenous, is the fact that the greatest domesticators of plants in the world are indigenous peoples, particularly indigenous women. The greatest knowledge holders about botanic knowledge are indigenous peoples. And they saw that constantly on the ground. And the other thing that is extremely important is how we are going to be engaging with indigenous youth. They are the future, and unless we do specific actions that are supporting the way that they incorporate knowledge and they maintain their oral knowledge in their communities, we are going to see a tremendous loss of knowledge across indigenous communities around the world. I would like to start talking about some of the advocacy work, and I think many of you have already mentioned the different ongoing initiatives in climate change. But I want to also bring into the picture the World Committee on Food Security that, as you know, takes place in October, and it involves IFA, WFP, and of course FAO, and it talks about food security in the world. I want to start talking about three triangular initiatives that FAO is facilitating that complement each other. The first one is the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems that was born in 2018 and was later endorsed in 2020. And I will talk in a minute about that. But for us, it's very important, the wrong group of friends of indigenous peoples. And I want to thank Canada and Ambassador Bugailiskis of Canada, because when we started in 2019, the wrong group of friends of indigenous peoples, We didn't know how it was going to work out. We didn't know if it was going to be a successful initiative. Today, we're extremely happy to see that it's one of the largest groups of friends on indigenous peoples in the world. And there's more than 42 countries that are engaging regularly to talk about indigenous peoples' knowledge. But the last but not least is the Coalition on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems. It came about in the aftermath of the 2021 UN Food System Summit. That's when we were collaborating with Professor von Braun. And here I need to particularly thank Professor and Dr. Massimo Torero, our chief economist, who has been supporting with actions many of the initiatives that FAO has been doing on indigenous peoples over the years. And many of these initiatives, in a way, have consolidated thanks to his support. Now, extremely important is the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems. It was the first time that in 2020, we presented to the members of FAO the need to have a platform of co-creation of knowledge between indigenous and non-indigenous that could advance the knowledge and the evidence base about indigenous people's food systems. We presented this at the Technical Committee on Agriculture, and I can tell you that we spent several nights without sleeping because we didn't know if the countries were going to support this initiative or not. Interestingly, they supported it, and they thought it was a fantastic idea, and ever since, the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples has been officially operating. We moved from 20 founding members, UN organizations, indigenous organizations, researchers, academics, universities, to 31 members. And I recognize many today here in the audience, and I'm extremely happy to collaborate with networks like IPON, like Abramat Initiative, and of course UNESCO, and many of the organizations that have been sharing their knowledge to co-create knowledge that can advance the evidence about the importance and relevance of indigenous peoples' food and knowledge systems. And we need to do this if we want to make things differently. Here you recognize Herb Yamanani, who is with us. It's great to see you, brother. And of course, Darío Mejía, who is the current chair of the UN Permanent Forum. And they are two of the main engines behind the success on the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Systems. The wrong group of friends started in 2019. It started very small with 12 countries. Today, there's 42 countries. And it's extremely important because what we have seen is that thanks to the advocacy work with the wrong group of friends on indigenous peoples, many of the ignorance, many of the preconceived ideas, and many of the resistances that some of the countries have vis-a-vis learning and sharing with indigenous peoples have been reduced. And we see that because more and more we see in the FAO delegations and in the delegations that the countries send to FAO, we see that they include indigenous scientists, they include some indigenous peoples, and very often some of the ambassadors and some of the delegates, they ask us to meet with some of the experts that they bring in their delegations who are now indigenous peoples. We have seen a change, and we invite other countries to join the wrong group of friends because it's an informal group where advocacy and information sharing is breaking many of the barriers of marginalization, ignorance that we need to bridge together. The coalition is important because it triangulates the advocacy work that the wrong group of friends is doing with the member countries, with the evidence-based gathering that the Global Hub is doing for indigenous and non-indigenous experts to work together and advance the agenda of knowledge. Why is the coalition important? Because it does offer a space for policy making, where recommendations can be made, and this is why it's so important that Brazil has joined the coalition. It's very important because countries, UN organizations, and indigenous organizations are working together to try to put different policies that can do things better. And let me share a clear example with all of you here. We have seen in our research that, for example, school feeding has sometimes a negative impact on indigenous people's food systems across the world when indigenous foods are not being taken into account in the menu. We have seen, for example, that everybody wants their children to go to school, but we have seen that the current education systems in some countries go actually against indigenous people's knowledge. So very often, what we have analyzed is that many of our well-intended policies are not having the intended effect when talking about indigenous peoples. We need to tweak that. And to tweak that, we need indigenous peoples to be at the table. And for indigenous peoples to be at the table, they need to sit chair by chair and next to the ambassadors and to the ministers and to the delegates to have their voices heard and make their own proposals. And this is why the coalition is extremely important. And we are very happy to see that today, with Brazil joining, the coalition has grown from the 7 founding member states to 15 founding member states. But we have also seen the number of indigenous organizations growing. And they represent the 7 sociocultural regions of the world in which indigenous peoples divide the world. And we have also seen the UN organizations growing and joining. We invite here the Pontifical Academy to join us, whether in the Global Hub, which is much more of the think tank that talks about the indigenous people's food systems, or in the coalition. The doors are open, and I think we will benefit greatly from talking. Probably we will not agree on everything, but that is the point, that we don't need to agree on everything. We need to agree on our disagreements and move forward to advance the evidence gathering and to advance the support to indigenous peoples. Last but by not least is the youth. And I think Her Excellency, the Minister of Brazil, talked about the youth. Of course, our colleague from UNDP on the Equator Prize talked about the youth. We cannot move forward without putting indigenous youth at the center. They are the future leaders of tomorrow. In 2016, FAO started working with the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. The first time that the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus managed to meet with all the regions was in FAO with the Director General in 2016. And thanks to this collaboration, we agreed to put together a UN forum dedicated exclusively for indigenous youth. The first one was celebrated in 2021. Due to the pandemic, we have to do that online. It takes place every 2 years. The second one took place in 2023, and it was extremely successful to see more than 186 indigenous youth traveling from all over the world to meet in FAO. And I want to call upon the support of the states, but I also want to call upon the support of the Vatican, because it's terribly painful to see that indigenous youth cannot travel because of visa issues. We need to put forward in the statement, perhaps, Professor von Braun, that if we want to make a better world, we need to facilitate indigenous peoples and certainly indigenous women and indigenous youth traveling. We saw even cases where transit visas were denied to people that have Schengen visa simply because they didn't have the transit visa to spend 2 hours in an airport to catch another flight. So we managed to bring 186 participants, but there were several that were rejected, and we lost the ticket, and they were in tears that they couldn't join the rest of the indigenous youth. We were surprised at the seriousness of indigenous youth. They had a very heavy agenda of work. They discussed about climate change, they talked about indigenous people's food systems, and they brought about the things that are concerning them and that are worrying them. And we need to listen and we need to do it together. FAO is implementing a number of initiatives, and I think many of you know about the Wipala paper. The Wipala paper was facilitated through the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems. Currently, we are working on another 3 participatory papers. One is about territorial management and biodiversity and climate change. There's another participatory research that we are doing with many organizations, which is very much linked to pandemics and indigenous peoples. And this is in collaboration with IPON. And extremely interesting, and something that we learned during COVID, is how many indigenous peoples confronted the pandemic and how they did that with their botanical knowledge. And it's something that is not written in any of our research papers. It's not written in our books, but they managed to save their communities with the knowledge. So we need to light here a light for all of us to incorporate this knowledge with full respect into some of the ongoing scientific work that is being done by our respective institutions, because very often there's some kind of marginalization in our minds that excludes these forms of knowledge. I see my sister Hindu across the road, across the room. If we include pastoralists, we are talking of almost 2 billion people in the planet that maintain their knowledge through oral transmission. This is more than the 10 million scientists that inform the community. So we have 2 billion daily researchers that depend on their traditional and oral knowledge to survive, and somehow we need to tap into that. I'm going to move fast. We are working, of course, on the characterization of indigenous people's food systems, and one of the things that we have learned is that there is right now 29 drivers that are affecting positively or negatively the continuation of indigenous people's food systems. If we go around the room and we looked at the initiatives in different countries that support the indigenous people's food systems in their country, you will not see many specific policies and budget lines dedicated to support indigenous people's food systems continuation in the different countries. And this is a problem. because indigenous people's food and knowledge systems are disappearing at an incredible rate. By the time we realize with our research approaches, it will be too late. So the time is now, and we need to do a consolidated effort now. The coalition has started this work, and I mentioned before how the coalition puts together policy recommendations. And something very important that we did with people like Herb and other leaders that are here in the room is that we propose to the World Committee on Food Security to include for the first time in the history, in the more than 50 years of work on the World Committee on Food Security, not once there has been an item on indigenous people. The coalition proposed to include indigenous people's food and knowledge systems as an area of discussion on the World Committee on Food Security, and this was adopted. This is one of the successes, and is why the coalition is important to issue policy recommendations for the countries that are informed by indigenous people's will. I'm going to close, and I would like to make one or two take-home messages, perhaps, for the statement. The first one for the statement from this is that we cannot co-create knowledge if indigenous peoples are dying to protect their lands. And when we looked at the first 5 countries in the world with the largest number of killings, they are all Christian countries. We need to call upon the Vatican to help stop this genocide against indigenous people, not only in Christian countries, in any other country in the world. But of course, there's a co-responsibility that we need to assume in what we are doing. The second message I would like to put on the table is that we need to include indigenous youth in what we are doing. Many of them are doing amazing work. Very often we forget of them. They are navigating 2 worlds. They use technology. They are, of course, incorporating traditional knowledge, and we need to bring them into the discussions. And we need to co-create knowledge that respects indigenous people's knowledge. And there's 2 or 3 pending areas that we all have. The first one is, of course, intellectual property rights. Indigenous peoples do not share their knowledge with us because they have seen way too many times scientists stealing their knowledge. We need to come up with a global mechanism that protects indigenous peoples' intellectual rights. The second thing is we need to recognize again that indigenous peoples are the great domesticators of plants. The pharmaceutical company has done some timid steps. We need to build upon that for the food security and for the food generation and food production system. This is essential if we need to do it. When we looked at the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, it talks about farmers. It does not talk about the indigenous peoples. We cannot solve the issues of food security in the world if we only talk about food production, because many of the indigenous people's food systems are food generation systems. Fishing is not a food production system. Hunting is not a food production system. Harvesting is not a food production system. All the systems that during the pandemic thrived were food generation systems, and they depend on Mother Earth's capacity to maintain and generate the ecosystem resource base. We are working on indigenous biocentric restoration to fight against the ongoing way that restoration is being brought about, because we believe that we need to put the spirituality and the wisdom that the old prophets had when they put religions together again into the table to make sure that the overflow of information that we are bombarded with daily transform into wisdom and knowledge. Thank you very much for the use of the word. My apologies for extending.